Alright, so inside of Maya, we're probably going to start with changing the material for the ground to something that resembles wood, so we can add some of those reflections and depth that we talked about during the paint over session. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a new render layer so that I can make sure that I can always reference the original image. Okay, and I'm gonna be hiding the lights so we can start fresh. Okay, and to select the lights, I'm gonna create a new camera, and I'm gonna be only showing lights, and then I'm gonna simply select them, hide them. So now when I render the image, it should come back completely black. And for the time being, I'm just gonna work with ambient light, which is kind of not recommended, but it's okay. So working on me. So now if we render, we should at least get something. Let me check the settings for this Omni light. I think it might be actually caring about where it is coming from. Yeah, so I'm gonna actually change this so that ambient shade is set to 0, so that it doesn't actually care where it is, because by default it tries to kind of give you a little bit of shading, but we don't want any of that. We kind of just want super basic lighting, at least for now. And I'm gonna be changing the intensity to something like 0.25. And looking at those reference images, I think it might help if this is a little bit warm. We might not even use this in the end, but at least for now, while we are setting up the shaders, it might help to have a little bit of just ambient light overall, you know? Maybe it's too saturated. But you can see that already by having some kind of united palette, it's helping to achieve this kind of mode that we see in the image that was lacking before when we had all these separate colors. Alright, so let's see what else we can do. Let's go to this material and let's assign a new bling. Assign new material, and I'm gonna pick bling. And then for the color, I'm actually gonna go in Photoshop and kind of mock together a simple wooden texture. I could just grab it from online, but I think it's kind of interesting to try and get one done really quickly, just to show you how I would do it. So let's see, let me create a bunch of horizontal shapes, and I'm gonna try to add some of those things that I mentioned about adding a little bit of imperfection. So I'm gonna be rotating it slightly, and I'm gonna be duplicating it, and again rotating it slightly, so that we can make it a little bit less perfect. Okay, I'm gonna be duplicating it again. Alright, and rotating it again, and then duplicate it again, move it. Okay, and rotating it again, and then most likely I will probably need to scale it, because this is probably a little bit too thick. Alright, and then let me actually turn this into a much darker version, like that. and actually invert it and colorize it. So it's a little brighter version. Alright, so even with just this image, why don't we try to export it and apply as the color for the ground. So I'm gonna be saving these as source images, wooden bump. Okay. Yeah. And I'm gonna export these as a JPEG. Okay. And I'm calling it a wood floor color. Right. So now on the bling, because we haven't applied it yet, this is what we're gonna get by default. So if we don't see any reflections, despite the fact that the material has reflections, like you can see by default the bling should have reflections, it probably comes down to, in your render globals, you have to go and enable ray tracing. So you can just probably go 3, 3, 3. It's gonna be fine. Alright, so let's try to render again. Alright, so now we're having reflections, right? Which is what we wanted, like we painted in this image. They're kind of washing out the image and they're not really helping, but also we're not getting the gradient that we talked about, so I'm going to show you how to do all that stuff. But first, let me get the color in. So under the color here, I'm going to go choose the texture we just made. Okay, and let's see what it looks like when we render. Alright, so this is already helping. And I think adding these kind of imperfections helps breaking up what otherwise would be a very perfect pattern, but it's a little too big here and it's a little too perfect. So what I'll do is find out where the camera is. So I'm gonna select the camera like that, and then I'm gonna go under display, show selection, make sure the camera is here. Let me see, where is it? Alright, so that's the camera right there. So if I go into Photoshop and look at it, we're probably looking my guess is that we're probably looking one of those big cracks. So I'm actually gonna go ahead and duplicate it, and I'm gonna try to add a little bit of interest over there. If you're not sure where exactly the textures are, you can use a simple trick and just have like something like a gradient and export that. You can even color it if it helps you. Anything that can help you get a feeling of where the textures are in space. So we're looking at black. So I think the plane is actually flipped. So we're probably looking up right there. So what I'll do, since this texture is getting so much attention, I'll go and make sure that there's something of interest in there. So I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to actually scale it and try to see if we can add a little bit of interest in there. Okay, and I'm gonna use the lasso to break this apart and delete all the rest, and I'm gonna sample the color and very quickly add some just some detail just to add a little bit of interest. Oops, didn't want to use black, wanted to use the foreground color. Okay, this is might be kind of weird because I'm texturing for this shot, but especially in a project where you know exactly what's going to be on camera, there's no reason to spend time texturing stuff that won't appear on the frame. So I don't think we're seeing it. I think, let me see, before and after. Yeah, I think we're actually probably over there. So I'm going to actually move it and place this here. Okay. And again, I'm gonna, and I might even duplicate this so that we can have a little bit more interest. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I might even break up this stuff. So I might rotate it and break this up a little bit. Okay. So let me re-export this and let me render this again. I don't see any change. Alright, I just had to update the texture. So it seems like the resolution is not the best. We might have to export higher resolution image, which might or might not be worth it. Something else we could do is use depth of field to help hide the detail that is lacking here, since we really just want to focus over there. So why don't we do that? Let's go into the camera and let's turn on depth of field. So under here, let's turn it on. And if we render now, it should look really weird and blurry because by default it's going to use a certain focus distance. To kind of get a good idea of where the focus should be, you can select something like the sphere or the volcano here, and you can go under display, UI elements, no, heads up display, and object details. So this should give you the distance from the camera, so 7.3. So we can actually go onto the camera now, and under the depth of field, we can change it. So let's change this to 7.3 and f-stop. We probably can make it something like 16, so it's not as blurry. So this may make the volcano a little bit out of focus. So we may want to find, yeah, so you see it's really out of focus. So in theory, changing the f-stop to a higher number should make the image less blurry. So you see we went from 16 to 32. Let's try 64. And then as far as the distance goes, I think it's right because we got the sphere right, but let's make the region scale something like 3. So this way we should have more stuff in focus around the sphere. Okay, so let's compare the image before depth of field and after. And my depth of field is kind of a cheat, so I wouldn't expect the greatest results ever. I think you're getting some blurry stuff, which is good. The volcano is getting a little blurry though, so I actually probably would change the focus distance to something like, let's see what the sphere is here, 21. So let's try to find something like in the middle of the two, between 7 and 31. So let's do something like 20. Hopefully the region scale will be enough to have both of them in focus. Okay, 20 gets that really in focus, so let's try 15. Alright, so 15 is giving us a pretty good balance between the two. Let's see what happens if we make the image a little bit blurrier. Okay, and let's increase the scale. So you see how these three settings really work together in trying to get an image that has depth of field, but it also allows you to have a sharp region in the middle of it. Alright, so let's make this back to 48. Let's do that. Alright, so now it's time to add some detail. So let's keep adding some breakups onto this texture. So like we did here, I'm gonna duplicate this stuff, and I'm gonna move it, and then I'm gonna duplicate it, and I'm gonna move it, and this is kind of stylized, but it would help to add a little bit of details too. And we could even duplicate all of those and kind of move them over here, and maybe rotate a little bit. Even just a little bit of rotation can help really break up repetitive patterns. We could also take some of those and then use a exposure setting so we can add some variations to the ground. So some of those will be affected and others won't. That also can help adding some interesting variation. And we can duplicate it, and we can place it over here. So we can actually get 3 different levels of interest. Something else we can do is duplicate everything, and then actually duplicate everything, including the background, and then merge it into one layer, and then multiply it, and kind of tweak it so that we get a little bit of extra detail on top. Okay, and then we can just blur it in one direction so we really lose all the detail. Okay. It's probably too much. Okay. And then we can actually set this to something like, let's try overlay. And let's change the levels. So what we're trying to do is simply add a little bit of interest to the wood without having to actually paint the texture and go through all that work. So that's what we have. So yeah, why don't we just export this and see what we get. Let me update the texture. So the reason why I haven't gotten into the lighting yet, and I'm focusing on the materials, is because, as you can see, you don't have to have very complex lighting if the materials are well built. They mostly will do, like, strong materials will do most of the work for you right off the bat. You can probably, I could probably keep going, but for the sake of the demo, I will keep this short, and I will actually take all of these and call it color, and then I will create a second one, call it bump, and this is actually going to be the same one, but I'm going to be using some filters to remove saturation and to gamma correct the image so that we get a little bit more interest. Something else that ideally I would want out of a bump is more streaks. So I'm actually gonna use a little trick and randomly some details like that, and I'm gonna fill it this color, and then I'm gonna just do the same thing we did before, where I'll blur it along an axis. Okay, and hopefully this will allow me to get some random details that can add interest to the image. Again, depending on the style you're working for, painting all the textures like this might not be the best idea, but if you're working on a stylized project, using photorealistic textures might not be the best starting point. I guess it all depends on what you're going for, right? So you see how I'm overlaying different patterns, and I'm rotating it slightly to add more imperfections, and then I'm gonna duplicate it again, maybe even flip it horizontally. The least amount of work you can do and still get your point across, the better. Okay. Let me set this to something like that. Alright. So I'm actually going to include this in the color. Set this to multiply, and I'm gonna re-export the color map. Okay. And then I'm gonna go into the bump, and I'm gonna export this as the bump. And I'm probably gonna reuse that for the specular map too. So let's render the new color. Hopefully the new details will add some interest. Right? And then let's go and add, let me change the default field because I think it's too strong. Say 60. So let me go into the material, and I'm gonna be going to the bump, and I'm gonna be adding the file we just created. Wooden floor bump. Okay, so by default it's probably gonna be too strong. Yeah, but you can see how it's nicely breaking up the reflections. Now the reflections are not as sharp. Again, because Maya software doesn't support blurred reflections, a good bump map is essential. So let's make this a little less strong. So instead of 1, it's 2.25. And these kind of artifacts that you're getting, that I'm getting, are because of the anti-aliasing. So let me actually go under the quality and set this to 4 and 10. So this should help increasing the quality of the anti-aliasing. So the image might take a little bit extra time to render, but it should help with some of the issues that we were getting on those edges. Let's try 6. So hopefully the image should be a little cleaner. Let's see what else we can do. Those reflections, like I said before, when we were working with the paint over, we want to grad them. So the easiest way to do that is to, it's a little bit of a trick, and you really only need to do this in Maya software because Manta Ray and all the other render engines like Renderman already have physical materials. But to get a fake Fresnel effect, you probably need to use this utility called the sampler info, and then you need a ramp. So play texture ramp. So a ramp is just a gradient, and in this case we want a gradient that goes from no reflection, so black, to full reflection. So we're gonna go from white to black. let's say, okay? And the color in the middle we can just delete. And then we want the glancing angle to drive the ramp, alright? So we're gonna go and middle click, drag onto that, and say other, and then use facing ratio to drive the vertical gradient of the ramp. The vertical gradient is this one along this axis, because by default the ramp is set to V. So then we can use this to drive the specular, right? So you see how the specular is down really strong in the middle? That's actually the opposite of what we want to do. So I'm actually going to take the white and turn it to black, and the black and turn it to white. Now you should see that the edges will be brighter, so you get more specular on the edges. Then I'm going to go to the color gain, and I'm going to actually map it with the same image we used for the bump map, so that we can make sure that we don't get any specular inside those dark recesses of the image. So let's see what happens now. Alright, so it's not too obvious that there's a gradient. So let me see what we can do to make it more obvious. Because we're dealing with an object like the ground that is only really visible in this shot from this angle, if we really want to get a very specific gradient, we can actually go in and adjust this specifically for the shot, so that we will get a really clean gradient. You see how we're getting a really nice gradient here? We can go and we can make it really defined. This way we can get exactly what we want out of the image. Alright, so I think this is a little too much, so push it back a little bit, and then we can move on to the actual lighting. So let's see what it was before. Okay, so this was before and after. So you see the gradient is helping. Let's see what we can do. Now let's try and start lighting this so that we get some gradients going, alright? Let's see. I still think this is a little too strong. It's kind of annoying, but I can't help it. So I'm actually gonna go and add some resolution over there. This is probably too late. I should have done this to begin with, but I'll make the image 248 so we can get more resolution. And scaling the image up like I did now actually will not give you more resolution if you just export the image, because you see there's no real detail, but we're only really gonna refocus on this area. It's a little bit of a waste of resources because we only need the resolution here, but it will help hopefully. So to the color, I'm gonna go and take these guys and I'm going to duplicate them, and I'm gonna scale them so they're a little smaller, and then I'm gonna be placing them so that we can get a little bit more interest right here where it's like right next to the camera. Make sure I know which one I'm using. Move those up. Okay, so this guy, I'm going to translate it so that it's right here, and I'm gonna delete that stuff so we don't have to worry about it. I'm actually gonna cut it, Control X, delete the layer and paste it so that when we transform it we know it's just what we want it to be. Okay, and I'm gonna try to add a little bit of detail here just for this portion of the shot, of the texture. let me actually delete those. I'm gonna just be working off this duplicate. And let me add some detail to it, because since we just scale the image up, we actually don't have any sharp detail. So adding some new lasso work can help us with that, can help us get some sharp edges, which we don't have now because we just scaled the image up. Again, let me see. Can probably go and do this here. Again, this is not exactly what I would do in a real shot, but since this is a locked off camera, there really is no point in detailing stuff that won't be on frame. Especially for the first few projects in school, I would recommend being very economical about where you choose to spend your time. Okay, so the image is going to be a little bigger, it's going to take a little longer to export. Alright, and then let's export the bump. Okay, and let's go here and reload the textures. Reload. Let's also reload the color just to make sure, and let's re-render and see what happens. Alright, so now we're getting some nicer texturing compared to before. We could also break those up if we wanted, because yeah, this is kind of big, but you can kind of tell what I'm trying to do here, right? If I feel like there's too much contrast here, so I probably would tone that down. The easiest way to do that is just add exposure and just offset the image slightly, maybe gamma correct it, so that you lose some of the contrast. Again, it's going to be a balance to try and maintain the same color, but add a little bit of, remove some of the contrast. You can also yeah, it's fine. You can also do the in software if you want to. You can go to the color texture and you can go under the color offset and you can add a little bit of red, for example. It's a tiny amount of red, and this should fill in some of those blacks. So you don't have to do everything in Photoshop, you see. You can regain some of those things just using the software tools. This will make the color image brighter. So you can actually go to the material, and let me actually rename this floor matte, and under the diffuse, let's make this 0.5, so the ground should hopefully come down a little bit. Okay, cool. We can actually make it, say, 0.4, or we could go to the color gain and make it a little darker. That also will do it, because they all multiply each other. Okay, so now that we have this, yeah, why don't we start with the lighting?